This video contains spoilers for Chapter 4, Act 1 from the Fontaine Archon quest. You have been warned. Lyney and Lynette put on an amazing magic show with their finale being a Switcharoo. During the quest, we actually get to see how they would have accomplished this. The question is, how would one actually create this design? Hello, Count Sacke here, back with another Genshin Impact video. Welcome to the first ever episode of Genshineering!
On a side note, I absolutely love that name. Sina would be proud.
Anyway, because this is the first episode, I should probably explain what the series is about. Genshineering is a series dedicated to looking at Genshin Impact with an engineering point of view. I will be providing analyses and critiques of existing in-game designs along with education on engineering topics. The series will cover applications of engineering concepts, calculations, examples of the design process, and the utilization of CAD software. Today we'll be designing the mechanism behind their amazing Switcharoo trick. If you haven't watched these two videos, especially the first one about how to measure distances, I won't go into detail about how to do so, and I will have to do measurements in this video. It's also worth mentioning that this episode will be separated into multiple parts, as this video would be way too long to release in a single video. With all that established, let's get started. What makes designing things difficult is that there are infinitely many ways to approach it, and it largely depends on the situation. As such, there is no right way of going about it. For my approach, I like to think of it being composed of three main aspects: function, geometry, and material. Function is what objective the system, or a specific part, is meant to accomplish. Geometry is the shape, size, dimensions, and/or how it meshes with other components. Lastly, material is what the object is made of, its material properties, as well as its cost. These three aspects are interconnected and all are related to each other. Combining all of them together, they make up the part to be designed. When you have a collection of parts, they make an assembly, and combining all of those assemblies and sub-assemblies can make up the overall product. The gist of what I just said means that each and every single part of your design has these three aspects, from things like a car transmission, computer, medicinal substance, or a building, down to the last nut and bolt, transistor, chemical, or brick. If you know enough about at least two of the aspects, you can determine the last aspect. This framework sets the basis for everything. Now, here's the hard part. It's inevitable that you'll have to make assumptions about the parts, then maybe refine those assumptions later down the line or even abandon them. Assumptions can come about due to a lack of information or even conflicting information. With these in mind, there are many ways to go about the design process. Most of the time, people already have in mind the function of the part, and from there you can assume geometry or material. I think it's more probable that geometry would be assumed, but if you're on a stricter budget or have specific required properties, material could be a better thing to look into first. The three aspects are like encompassing groups. They all have a set of variables in them. You need to assume things about those variables to determine the unknown variables in another aspect. These arrows on the diagram are meant to show that everything is related to each other, specifically via equations. We can use these relations to determine the values of other variables. Something that you should note is that you don't have to assume everything about a part's geometry or material. You could assume like most of the dimensions, but then you want to solve for the thickness of the part with a specific material. Then for the parts where you assumed a specific geometry, you could try to calculate a material that meets requirements. With that said, I think an example could actually help in this situation. So let's look at a storage container with a lid. Under function, we can assume that we want it to carry a minimum of 5 kilograms or about 11 pounds. We can also assume it to be rectangular. We actually already know that between the geometry of the lid and the opening to the container, they need to match, so they must share the same length and width. This actually shows that there is important relationships between other parts. So we have the base of the container, the body of the container that stores the objects. It is also geometrically linked with another part, which is the lid. Just from that, we've identified quite a lot about the shape for the container and its lid. The thing is, we won't get anywhere without assuming at least a few dimensions. You have to start somewhere, but there are also other conditions that could help aid you in making your assumptions. I could ask questions. For example, what sorts of things is this container designed to carry? I'll provide a list of other considerations and questions that you could answer, but I think it's best that you just pause and read through them, otherwise I'd be here all day. Clearly, there's a lot of things that one needs to think about. Let's say you want to carry cold drinks, like soda cans. That's function. We need to have insulation, this is under the material aspect, to minimize the amount of heat reaching the drinks. This implies that the thickness of the container body, geometry, is very important. The thicker the container, the less heat that can get through. Maybe to gauge how well the storage is, we assume that we want to ensure that the drinks remain below a specific temperature for at least some amount of hours. Function. This can be determined through the heat transfer rate. You could approach this by assuming the thickness, then checking the material required, but you could also do it in the other way around. You calculate the thickness needed for an assumed material. If you find that the container is inadequate at keeping the drinks cool, we'll just have to adjust the thickness and/or material. All of this is to say that design is an iterative process, and there are many ways to go about it. You make assumptions, come up with something, check if it meets its requirements, make changes if necessary, and repeat until you're satisfied. While of course I don't expect you to be able to come up with a design for something immediately after hearing that, I do hope that it at least gives you an idea for what goes on in the design process. The iteration aspect is really the most important thing to note about it. A lot of changes are made throughout design, and maybe with more experience you might not need as many assumptions or changes, but it does take a while. Before we go on, I have some bad news. Unfortunately, mechanical design requires a huge ton of background. It is literally the culmination of a whole college degree's worth of courses and topics. It's very likely that most people watching this video probably don't meet the prerequisites, so I'd like to go into as much detail as I can. However, this means that if I want to truly explain things thoroughly enough, these videos are going to be long, and will take a while to make. Trust me, if this first part isn't already telling of how long this will be, you're in for a ride. To start off the design process, we need to establish the objectives for what we're trying to make. But in order to do that, we need to gather as much information as possible. While familiarizing ourselves with the situation, we can also identify the variables in the main aspects. For context, Lyney and a supposedly randomly chosen audience member, Halsey, were to suddenly switch places between two distantly placed boxes, one on stage and the other in the audience. After a minute, Lyney came out of the box in the audience, and had the performance gone as intended, Halsey would have appeared on stage in the box with no one none the wiser. Unfortunately, their performance was interrupted and tampered with. Halsey had completely disappeared, and one of Lyney's assistants, Cowell, was crushed and killed. The two magicians ended up becoming the prime suspects for the disappearance of Halsey and the death of Cowell, thanks to Farina. Lyney and Lynette, trying to prove their innocence, explained the magic trick to the Traveler, Paimon, Navia, and some guards in an underground passage. Now, what better way to explain how it works other than having the creators themselves do so? Take it away, Lyney and Lynette. I just want to take this time to thank WoWQuests for recording footage of the dialogue and the cutscenes for the Fontaine Archon quest. Unfortunately, I don't have my own personal video recordings because I didn't know that I would be trying to create this trolley thing, and by the time it happened, well, I'm already smack middle of it, so yeah. I only got the footage from 2 sources, which are shown on screen right now. I will have these linked in the description below, as well as a link to WoWQuest's YouTube channel. Again, thank you very much, WoWQuests.
I appreciate your kind interest. Come with me. We'll be heading below stage.
Huh? Below stage?
Yes, a world of secrets is hidden beneath this magic box, prepared specifically for this switcheroo trick. But before I reveal everything, you should have a look first. Notice anything strange here? I'm not trying to be dramatic. Remembering the details of a trick will help you understand the methods used to perform it more easily.
Huh. Weren't there balloons and other decorations here? Where did all that go?
Ah, good eye. That said, you're still far from discovering the answer.
The back? You mean the inside of the door? What's different about it? Paimon didn't notice anything.
Very good indeed. I thought you might not be able to catch that, given that you were sitting in the first row. The back of this door was patterned. Those patterns are now gone, replaced by a smooth wooden board. So, if you put 2 and 2 together, what do you get? Exactly. All right, let's go. I'll tell you how it works as we head down.
Oh, so there was a passageway under the magic box!
I knew you'd figure out most of it as soon as you saw this place. The 2 magic boxes are positioned right above the 2 entrances of the tunnel. See this flatbed trolley? The box with the lucky audience member in it would be shuttled over to the other side using the trolley.
This trolley can raise and lower and even rotate, ensuring that the box will face in the right direction.
I see. So that's the purpose of the box inside another box.
Precisely. The inner box would descend after the audience member was put inside and be moved along the trolley, all while the outer box would remain on stage as if nothing had ever changed.
So that's how you did it!
Once the box was lowered, the trolley would store some energy through this device here, with which it would complete the rest of the steps. The audience member would only be able to feel some slight movements in the dark, and by the time she walked out, she would already be back on stage.
Right! You were talking that whole time, and you even came out for a moment near the end!
Ah, yes. A phonograph operated by Lynette was used to achieve that effect. My assistant and I had already scripted our conversation beforehand. When the countdown began, I had already gone to the opposite box via a tunnel using that ladder.
And what about Lynette? Where was she?
I was in the mezzanine space in the back of the box.
Oh, interesting!
That's how we were able to coordinate Lyney's lines with the assistant. And, by the way, I was the one who walked out of the box at the end.
I mean, we are twins. All it takes is a change of clothes and no one can tell who's who. And that's my favorite part of this trick. Only Lynette and I can perform it.
So that's how it all worked! Wow! Every detail you revealed was more amazing than the last!
Lynette would briefly walk out of the box and then go back in, jumping into the tunnel and escaping before the box on the trolley could finish ascending. And then I walk out of the other box in the audience area, and the trick would be complete. The operative word here being would. But as you saw, Cal was in the box, not our audience member. She, on the other hand, mysteriously vanished.
We really don't know how that happened.
At the end of the passage, we can get close to the flatbed trolley. It looks quite basic and appears to be lacking the whole raising and lowering aspect. Unfortunately, this does mean that we'll have to come up with our own mechanism for how it accomplishes that, among the other things that it needs to do. Something of note is that it looks like the inner box can be placed on the trolley. I measured the length and width of the trolley to be 2.8 meters by 2.5 meters respectively. I didn't measure the height because, I'll be honest, I think that aspect needs modification. In the underground passage, I measured the length, width, and height, specifically the height for the lower ceiling area. It came out to be 47 meters long, 9.8 meters wide, and 4.7 meters tall. Paimon in the case record says this:
Digging a tunnel just for a magic trick? Whew, that must have been a lot of work.
I honestly have a very hard time believing it, but Lyney and Lynette actually had a passage dug just for their magic show. This place seems to be in very good condition. Well, relatively speaking. Look, if a crime didn't happen, then perhaps it would look better. Whatever. For some reason, they spent the time and Mora to make it look all fancy with molding and everything. For me, I can only believe that this much work would be done on the tunnel if it was going to be permanent from here on out. They even have other stuff that doesn't look related to their magic show, so I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion. This means that we have to work with the dimensions of the passage that we've measured. At most, I'll assume that any items inside of the passage can be moved around, such as tables, chairs, clothes, mannequins, shelves, etc. Another aspect to note is that the passage is completely flat and horizontal. This means that the box in the audience is clearly higher up than the stage. So this trolley needs to lift the inner box to this height at least. We can measure the height of the floor the box is on to the lowest point by gliding. Note that I started gliding from the top of the box, so I had to subtract the height of it to get the actual value. The measurement came out to be 5.35 meters. Unfortunately, we do not know how far down the underground passage is, and we'll have to assume it. For the box, I measured the dimensions to be 2.5 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, and 3.2 meters tall. Lastly, I measured how high the stage is from the floor, which was 2.75 meters. In summary, these are the dimensions I'll work with. If we don't account for the floor thickness, the lift would need to be raised by about 11 meters up. I personally think that the floor being about 50 centimeters or 35.5 inches thick seems reasonable. I also need to account for the fact that the ceiling is a bit higher up in the places where the box is lowered. So, for our case, I'll design it to lift up to at least 12 meters. From examining the control panel towards the entrance, it is implied that the trolley would start moving automatically and autonomously once initiated, and that no one, including the stage crew, were to be moving the trolley. This means that the trolley is moved with its own motors, likely powered by Fontaine's energy source. We'll assume that the energy is converted to electricity to operate the motors. We were told by Lyney that the trolley needs to reach the other side in 60 seconds. However, if we look back at the performance, it actually was longer. Before the countdown, it appears that Halsey has already entered the box, as she is no longer beside Cowell.
I'm sorry, it might be a little cramped inside, but no need to feel nervous.
Okay.
All right. Before I enter the magic box, there is one more thing I need to ask the audience to do.
Lyney also talks for a bit longer before he eventually starts the countdown himself. If we go off of dialogue length, it takes about 50 seconds after she enters the box to start the countdown. At the end of the countdown, there's a whole 30 extra seconds before Lyney was to reveal Halsey on the other side. Unfortunately, this is when things go wrong, so we never see the trick played as intended. Based on this extra bit of delay, it would mean that the travel time is actually around 2 minutes and 20 seconds. We also see Lynette, dressed to look like Lyney, exit and re-enter the box in the last 5 seconds. If she was there, the box could not have been raised yet. Otherwise, we'd see Halsey. This means that lowering should take at most 30 seconds. However, to allow ample time for Lynette to get into the tunnel, I'll say that it needs to be raised in 20 seconds. In short, what we'll do is allocate 30 seconds for lowering, 87 seconds for slowly moving across the 47-meter long tunnel, and 20 seconds for raising. For one last bit of controls, we need to be able to rotate the box around. For simplicity, I'll let the rotation start when the trolley has finished lowering. The important part is that it should be done by the time it reaches the opposite side of the tunnel, so I'll assume that the rotation takes 87 seconds as well. To help visualize all of the events, I created this timeline and it shows the general durations of things when certain events happen, so hopefully it makes things clear. For the tracks, they honestly look pretty bare bones, and it doesn't need to be that fancy since this is for a single show at this location. The most important parts about them is that they need to be fastened in place, properly aligned and smooth. Speaking of smoothness, we now need to talk about material. We know that the box is made of wood. There may be other materials inside, but I'll assume that they don't contribute any significant weight. Looking at the types of wood in Fontaine, I believe the box is most likely to be made of mallow wood. From the description, it's quite strong as it's used in foundations and frames of houses. Also, one of the items that can be created with it is the sturdy cargo container, so I think it's reasonable for the application. Unfortunately, mallow wood does not seem to exist IRL. However, I have noticed the shape of the leaf from its sprite looks similar to that of maple leaves. Because of this, I'll assume that it has properties of maple wood. The trolley appears to be made of wood, but I'll leave that one open to potentially be made of some sort of metal with a wooden cover. I'll also assume that the lifting mechanism will need to be made of metal as well. One last assumption we'll make is that the randomly selected audience member, supposedly, would be an average European adult, which means that they would weigh about 70 kilograms or 156 pounds, but just to be safe, I'll increase the load to 90 kilograms or approximately 176 pounds. With all of that established, I think that should be everything that we need to know about our situation. We should now be able to set our design objectives and have a clear idea of what they should be. The design objectives are a list of parameters that need to be satisfied in order for the design to be considered satisfactory. At first, we only really knew that we needed to somehow transport someone between two stage locations. However, now that we have a better picture of the situation, we can actually be more specific. These specific design objectives are actually what we're looking for, so now we should be able to establish them. For our objectives, we must satisfy the following parameters. First, the trolley must travel 47 meters in 87 seconds on flat ground. Second, the trolley must be able to lower the box 12 meters in 30 seconds and raise it 9.4 meters in 20 seconds. Third, it must be capable of rotating the inner box 180 degrees in 87 seconds. And finally, fourth, it can carry a human with a weight of at most 90 kilograms. We could end up adding more or even revising these in the future, but as much as possible, we should try to stick to what we originally intended. After all, the main goal is to make sure that the illusion is complete. So as long as we make sure that the illusion is complete and that everything is viable, we can make slight adjustments. But again, it's best to not try and constantly tinker and tune things. You will get lost. The challenge of this design is that we require 3 different motions, or what is known as degrees of freedom. It must be able to lift or lower, translate horizontally forward and backward, and rotate the inner box around. Somehow, we need to integrate all of these three motions into a single unit. Out of the three, lifting and lowering is the most difficult and mechanically demanding, so I believe that it should be the starting point and set the basis for everything else. The first thing we need to think about is how we'll raise and lower the box. Immediately, what came to my mind as soon as I tried to actually think of this project was that it would use a scissor lift. This contains links that are connected together like an X. At the center of each X, the two links can pivot. Like scissors, if you spread the links apart, it'll shorten but become wider, and if you bring the links closer together, it'll elongate but become thinner. For my design, I decided to accomplish bringing the links closer together by using a slider and lead screw. When rotating the lead screw, the slider can move inward and outward to raise or lower the lift. The slider will have a threaded hole which the lead screw will be screwed into. A stepper motor with a lead screw shaft coupled to it can be utilized as it's capable of precise rotations, thus accurately raising the lift to the desired height. It is also very likely that we'll need many revolutions of turns, so a servo motor may not be the best choice. One important aspect about the lead screw is that the slider must be constrained to only move along one axis. It should not be able to rotate, so it should only have 1 degree of freedom as we mentioned earlier, translational motion forward and back. Luckily, this problem is pretty easy to address by adding a groove which the slider can fit onto. Another option is to have a shaft that spans the entire lead screw, which will fit into a hole on the slider. But it depends on how we'll go about it with that. We'll get more specific with the design once I actually have an idea of what the frame looks like. Great, we have a basic concept in mind. However, we don't know any specifics about our system. This is where we need to make some assumptions. Let's recall some of our constraints. The scissor lift mechanism needs to fit in an area smaller than 2 by 2 square meters. The trolley is 2.7 meters long and it's 2.5 meters wide. For one last thing, we need to be aware of the clearances that apply when the box is on the platform. When the box is fully lowered, we know that this has to be less than the height of the lowest ceiling in the underground passage, which is about 4.7 meters tall. So that's a clearance that we need to keep in mind. So at the end of the chain of scissor links, we could have a flat platform directly at the top. This first option could work, however, it may not fit in the passage, which is only 4.7 meters tall. I also might want to add an extra clearance of 15 centimeters, leaving only 4.55 meters for the total height. The second option is to have the platform hang at a lower position. If we take a look at the geometry of the scissor lift, the following equations can be derived. Y is equal to L times sine theta, X is equal to L times cosine theta, Z is equal to N times Y plus Y naught minus YP, and lastly, H is equal to Z plus Y box, where L is the length of each link, N is the number of times the scissor linkage is repeated, Y naught is how high off the ground the pivot for the bottom link is, YP is by how much the platform is lowered, and Y box is the height of the inner box. X and Y are the horizontal and vertical distances respectively between the two ends of the link. Z is the height of the platform the inner box rests on. Lastly, H is the height from the bottom to the top of the inner box. All of these quantities are when the links are at an angle theta from the horizontal ground. From these, we can calculate important variables for the linkage, such as the ones shown on screen. And these are the equations to calculate them. when thinking about the geometry of our situation, there is an optimal length of the linkages such that we can maximize the number of scissor linkages. If we define W as the width of the link, then we can imagine that the scissor linkage, when it's at its most compact, will have the links sitting directly on top of each other. The height between these links would exactly be W. This means that the optimal value for L can be obtained with Pythagorean theorem. To move the trolley, we need to consider a transmission and drive system. I decided to go with something very similar to that of a car, but much simpler. I'll utilize one single motor to rotate all the 4 wheels. I chose one motor because if there were more, I'd have to make sure that they all spin at the same rate. I imagined that there would be one drive shaft and 2 wheel shafts, one for the front and one for the back. The drive shaft is supposed to receive rotation from the motor. However, we're not just coupling the shaft directly to the motor output. For one, we may need to step up the torque. This means that we need to consider a drive system. I first thought of using a belt drive with pulleys, however I quickly remembered that gear drives exist and thought it would be better for this application. Since we're not trying to go for something complicated, I decided to go with spur gears as they would be much simpler to manufacture and are cheaper than helical or herringbone gears. Plus, we technically do know they exist in-game. The question is now this: how do we transmit rotation from the transmission shaft to the wheel shafts? They are literally perpendicular to each other. For this, I recalled that bevel gears can be used to transmit rotation to intersecting shafts. If we look at the drive shaft and extend it to the wheels, we would see that this would literally intersect with the wheel shafts. The rotation mechanism of the inner box is quite simple. On the lift platform, there will be a turntable and the inner box will sit on top of it. To rotate this, there are 2 possibilities that I considered. The first is to directly couple the turntable to the output of a servo motor. Servo motors are best utilized for high accuracy angular positioning and high speed applications while providing pretty high torque. So it'll be great for rotating the box around. Servo motors sound amazing, and trust me, they are pretty great, and they're constantly used in the industry. But the problem is servo motors, despite their high accuracy, it comes at a price. Servo motors have limited rotation ranges. You can find servo motors that are continuous, but instead of accurate angular positioning, you get accurate speeds. The second possibility is to have a DC motor with a gear coupled to its shaft, and this will rotate another gear which is coupled to the turntable. The turntable will have a potentiometer to be able to check the angular rotation of the box. You can think of this as a custom servo motor. The second design is better suited if we can't find a servo motor that is able to meet our requirements. I'll be able to pick one of these designs once we get into the kinematic and force analysis in another part. While Halsey was to be on the trolley, Lyney said that she would only be able to notice very small vibrations. This means that she isn't supposed to notice that she's moving. If she realizes this, it could potentially spoil the trick. There are various ways people perceive motion, through sight, vibrations, and some sort of bodily sensation. Sight is one of the biggest contributors to perceiving motion. Luckily, Halsey is inside a solid box with no windows, so that checks out. Unfortunately, vibrations are inevitable as the surface of the tracks have imperfections and aren't completely smooth. One way to minimize the vibrations is to isolate the inner box with a suspension system. However, I believe this approach is overkill for this project. I personally think that a better way to tackle this problem is to just put cushioning and padding on the floors and walls. This won't get rid of the vibrations, but it should be good enough. Lastly, for the bodily sensation, this is typically caused by changes in acceleration. So, if we're able to make sure that changes in acceleration are small and that the acceleration is small, we should be able to minimize bodily sensations. Unfortunately, given the time limit of 2 minutes, this might be difficult to accomplish. If anything, ensuring that Halsey makes it to the stage takes priority. There's another issue that could potentially ruin the magic trick. it doesn't really have to do with motion at all. Since Halsey is to be lowered into the underground passage, the sound of the audience would become more muffled. Unfortunately, this is another inevitable problem that we can't really solve. One solution is to add soundproof foam on the inner box to make the reduction in volume less. Another possibility is that we can add speakers into the underground passage, playing the audience cheers. Since our focus with this video series is mainly on the trolley, I'll leave this option up to Lyney and Lynette to figure out what they want to do with this. Some people might say that they can easily tell when they're moving, even when their eyes close, so these don't help much. I very much disagree with that sentiment. Let me remind you of motion simulators. When we have the bodily sensations coupled to a film to accompany those movements, our brains are tricked into thinking that we're moving when you're really not. If you don't believe that this works, well, the amusement and theme park industry literally make rides using motion simulators, entertaining millions of guests based on the illusion of movement. If you can trick the brain into thinking it's moving when it isn't, then it can be reasonable to assume that the opposite can be tried. I mean, when you're on an escalator or a travelator? Whatever. Moving walkway. If you close your eyes, do you really feel like you're moving? What about the surface of the planet? The Earth's surface is actually moving at a pretty high tangential velocity. Despite that, you still feel stationary. In any case, sorry, I just really had to talk about it because I love motion simulator rides. Anyway, for the next part, I tried to replicate the 3D model of the outer box in SolidWorks using the measurements I obtained earlier. I mostly just eyeballed a lot of the sizes, but I did try to recreate the model accurately by using Aether and his height, which should be about 165 centimeters, to calculate approximations for some of the dimensions. Just so you know, SolidWorks is an engineering, computer-aided design, or CAD software. There's a lot of things that it can do, but what I'm doing right now is 3D modeling. If you want to learn how to use any of the programs I show throughout the series, you can always look up tutorials as I don't really have the time to explain them myself. I would recommend this video playlist by Less Boring Lectures. Out of all the mechanisms, there is one that I was pretty scared wouldn't work out, and that's the doors. The thing is, both the inner and outer boxes need doors, but we somehow need to hide that there are two of them. The first and lazy option would be to not have any doors on the inner box. This would require the underground passage to have all of its lights turned off, and this is a pretty big hazard since Lyney and Lynette both need to use it while the trolley travels across. Another issue is that this would easily ruin the illusion for Halsey for two reasons. She would feel air brushing against her as the trolley moved, and that the sound of the machinery would be easily audible. All of this is to say that no doors on the inner box is not an option. So, how would we go about this? Let's get the easy thing out of the way. The outer box's doors will use classic hinges. In SolidWorks, I created the outer doors to find out roughly how heavy it would be, and then did a quick calculation to see what screw size would be needed. Turns out, pretty much any standard size will do. To narrow things down, I unscrewed one of my door's hinge screws and checked the size. It was an M4 by 25 size. After doing this, I went to create a simple hinge which consists of 2 leaves and a pin. We don't need anything more complicated than this. After finalizing the dimensions of the hinge, I modified the outer box and the doors to have appropriate screw holes. Lastly, I put everything together for the outer box in an assembly file. Now for the hard part, the inner box's doors. If we use the same mechanism as the outer one, the inner doors would certainly be easily seen as separate. Another consideration is that the inner doors need to open with the outer doors, or that the inner doors need to be opened before the outer doors are opened. If the inner doors are closed, this would obviously be very confusing and has the highest chance of spoiling the trick. For me, I think that having the inner doors open and close independently from the outer doors is simpler. We'll need to include an extra mechanism to automatically close and open the doors. We also need to minimize the amount of swing the inner doors pivot into the box. This could pose a hazard to Halsey, as she could potentially get hit or accidentally get caught between the closing doors. The simplest design that I can think of is to make use of a sliding foldable door on the inside. It's far from the most seamless option, but honestly, I have no idea how else to do this given the constraints. The sliding foldable door can be opened and closed by moving a slider which the edge of the door is coupled to. For the sliding mechanism, I think a lead screw would be too much. Instead, I think a belt drive would be more efficient. For the belt, I'll choose a timing belt. Now, here's one problem that we need to address. Because we have 2 doors on the left and right side of the inner box, they naturally needed to move in opposite directions to fold. The thing is, I would prefer it if I could use a single motor and a single belt. We can't just simply couple, quote-unquote, the sliders to the belt. This would move them in the same directions. The solution is to, quote-unquote, couple the sliders to the belt. But one of them is on the opposite end. The belt goes around the pulleys, so it's natural that on one side of the belt, it is moving in the opposite direction. We can take advantage of this and couple the sliders to the opposite sides of the belt. I drew out 2 configurations, one where the pulley is vertically oriented and another where the pulley is horizontal. I jumped between the 2 and almost convinced myself to use a horizontal configuration, hence why I bothered to draw a 3D version of it. In the end, I think the vertical pulley configuration would be more beneficial in terms of its compactness. To quote-unquote couple the sliders to the belt, I decided to create a simple clamp design. 2-piece rectangular blocks with 2 screws to pull one block onto the other, giving the clamping force. I decided to put counterbores for the screw to minimize their length and because it looks nicer with it being flush to the block. I won't be able to create the CAD file for this one yet because I need to run some calculations before I can get the dimensions and geometry down. Instead, there's a more pressing issue at bay that needs focus. Going back to the outer box, something that did worry me is that the area for the whole of the box was quite small. To add more to the problems, Lynette does say this.
And what about Lynette? Where was she?
I was in the mezzanine space in the back of the box.
Lynette is actually supposed to fit inside the outer box. This makes things complicated. Even if I try to make a small ledge for Lynette to stand, the inner box will be too small. It was here that I realized that something was really off. I mentioned before that in the last 5 seconds of the countdown, we see Lynette exit the box and re-enter. And we're also later told that she went into the tunnel before the box was raised.
Lynette would briefly walk out of the box and then go back in, jumping into the tunnel and escaping before the box on the trolley could finish ascending.
So far, everything works out. Unfortunately, it was here that I realized that we have contradicting information. The area of the box is smaller than the area of the entrance to the tunnel. The outer box area is 2 by 2 square meters. The tracks are wider than 2 meters, which is fine, but this ladder is approximately an additional 1 meter. In order for this to work, there's only one possibility I can propose. There's another additional small chamber located between the tunnel and the theater floor. I think that this would be the best solution, as it's the only way that allows Lynette to safely enter the tunnel before the box is raised. Now, we have a pretty big problem at the moment. The size of the hole for the outer box is very small. I said that before, so what gives? Well, this doesn't leave much space at all for the lift to fit through. Again, that's pretty obvious. But because the hole is kinda small, it severely limits how long the linkages can be. In turn, this means that we need to repeat the scissor mechanism pattern more. And when you repeat the scissor mechanism pattern, that also increases the overall height of the box when it's fully retracted, which we said earlier can't be taller than 4.55 meters. I hope we can see the problem here. The only way I have any hope of continuing this is by getting into the physics and math behind this design. However, that's a whole other set of topics worth an entire video or more. I could be overreacting to this, but hey, this is engineering. Overlooking things can be very risky and even life-threatening. Better safe than broken. To recap, we managed to get an idea for how the different mechanisms for the trolley would work. For raising and lowering, it uses a scissor lift. For horizontal movement, it uses a basic transmission system. And for rotation of the inner box, it makes use of a turntable. I also got to create 3D CAD files for the inner and outer box. The outer box's model is pretty much done, but the inner box still needs work. In summary, we've laid out the foundations for the design. This video was getting very long, and I have been promising it for a while now, so I think that leaving the calculations for the next video would be a good place to leave things. I'm really happy to finally start the Genshineering series. I already have a few video ideas in mind, so stay tuned for more. Fun fact, the Switcharoo Trolley wasn't actually meant to be the first episode. The reason why it is now the first episode is because, well, the underground passage is only accessible for a limited time period based on how far you progress into the Archon quest. So basically, until I'm confident I no longer need to go down into the underground passage, I'm stuck at this part of the Archon quest. Despite how much effort I put into making this one, I don't expect it to get many views since my type of content is rather niche. But I would very much appreciate it if you could share this video, give it a like, and let me know what you think. With that, thanks for watching and hope you've enjoyed.